Most of what you were taught about the Spanish Empire is a story about gold. The version you know goes something like this. Spain sent conquistadors across the ocean, they toppled the Aztecs and the Inca, they came home with galleons full of treasure, and for a golden century, Spain was the richest and most powerful empire on earth until somehow it slowly faded, outcompeted by cleverer, more modern rivals like England and Holland. The treasure made Spain great. The greatness eventually passed. A natural rise and fall. It is a clean story. It has conquistadors and galleons and mountains of silver, and it makes the decline sound almost dignified like a sunset, which is probably why it survived. But here is the problem with that story. The treasure did not make Spain rich. The treasure is what made Spain poor. Let me say that again because it inverts everything. The single largest deposit of silver ever discovered in human history, a mountain of almost pure silver in the Andes, was found, owned, and mined by the Spanish crown. And the flood of wealth that poured out of it did not build Spanish industry or Spanish farms or a Spanish middle class. It hollowed all of them out. Within a century of finding the greatest fortune on earth, the Spanish crown had declared bankruptcy again and again and again. The richest empire in the world could not pay its bills. And the reason it could not pay its bills is the same reason it had all that silver in the first place. The real story of the Spanish Empire is not written in treasure. It is written in ledgers. In a mountain in Bolivia that the locals called the one that eats men. In a labor draft so lethal that historians have compared it to a death sentence. In the price of bread in Madrid, which quietly quadrupled and destroyed the people it was supposed to enrich. And above all, it is written in the account books of a group of foreign bankers in Genoa and Antwerp, men who never crossed the ocean, never dug a single ounce of ore, and who ended up owning nearly all of it. It is a story about a curse disguised as a blessing, about how the most spectacular stroke of luck in economic history became the instrument of an empire's ruin, about the moment a country discovered that having infinite money and having a functioning economy are not the same thing at all, and that the first can quietly destroy the second. So let's go back, not to the galleons and the conquistadors, but to a single afternoon on a cold Andean plateau, higher than almost any place people have ever chosen to live. Because the true origin of Spain's ruin does not start in Madrid. It starts with a runaway llama and a mountain that should not exist. In 1545, in what is now Bolivia, at an altitude of over 4,000 meters, 13,000 feet, a place where the air is thin enough to make a healthy man gasp, there was a conical red mountain that the indigenous Andeans called Potosi. The story, which may be part legend, is that a local herder named Diego Gualpa was chasing a runaway llama up the slope, grabbed a shrub to steady himself on the steep ground, and pulled it out by the roots, and there, in the soil clinging to the roots, was silver. Not a vein of silver, not a promising trace. The mountain was, to a degree that is genuinely difficult to comprehend, made of silver. The Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, would turn out to be the single most concentrated deposit of silver ever found anywhere on the planet, before or since. Over the following centuries, it would produce, by some estimates, 60% of all the silver mined in the entire world. You have to understand what this meant in the 16th century, because money then was not an abstraction the way it is now. Money was metal. A coin was worth what it weighed in silver or gold. There was no paper currency, no central bank, no credit card. The money supply of a nation was, quite literally, the quantity of precious metal it physically held, and Spain had just discovered a mountain of it. To grasp the scale, you have to also know what else Spain had, because Potosi was not alone. In 1546, the very next year, the Spanish found another colossal silver strike at Zacatecas in Mexico, and then the timing delivered a final gift. In the 1550s, a refining technique using mercury, the patio process, was perfected, which allowed the Spanish to extract silver from lower-grade ore on an industrial scale. A mountain of silver, a second great mine, and a new technology to process it all at once. Spain now controlled a river of money flowing out of the New World unlike anything the world economy had ever absorbed. By any logic that seems intuitive to us, this should have made Spain unassailable, the permanent superpower of Europe, rich beyond the reach of any rival. It did the opposite, and to understand why, you have to understand what all that silver was actually for. Here is the critical thing that most popular accounts of the Spanish Empire gloss over entirely, because it is not romantic, and it involves economics rather than conquistadors. The silver of Potosi did not stay in Spain. It could not stay in Spain. It was, from the moment it was dug out of the mountain, already spent. Let me explain how the machine worked, because it is the engine of the whole story. The Spanish crown claimed a fifth of all silver mined in its empire, a tax called the Quinto Real, the royal fifth. That alone was a colossal income. But the Spanish crown, and specifically the two Habsburg kings who defined this era, Charles V and then his son Philip II, had ambitions that outran even a mountain of silver. They were fighting more or less continuously on every front in Europe. They were fighting the French. They were fighting the Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean. They were fighting a brutal decades-long war to suppress a Protestant rebellion in the Netherlands. They were funding the Counter-Reformation across the continent. Charles V ruled an empire so vast, Spain, the Netherlands, much of Italy, Austria, the German lands, and all of the Americas, that it was said the sun never set on it, and holding it together meant war without end. War is the most expensive thing a state can do, and it has to be paid for now. You cannot tell an army to wait for next year's treasure fleet. So the Spanish crown did what governments in a hurry always do. It borrowed. And here is the fatal mechanism. It borrowed against the silver that had not yet arrived. The crown would go to bankers, and the bankers were not Spanish. Remember that, it matters enormously, and it would take out enormous loans to pay its armies today, pledging the silver from next year's fleet or the year after's as security. In plain language, Spain was spending the silver before the ships carrying it had even left the Americas. So picture the flow. Silver is torn out of a mountain in Bolivia by forced labor. It is minted into coins, the famous pieces of 8, the first true global currency. It is loaded onto the treasure fleet and sailed across the Atlantic to Seville. And the instant it arrives, it does not enter the Spanish economy. It passes straight through Spanish hands and out the other side, to the foreign bankers who had already lent against it, to the foreign merchants who supplied the goods Spain no longer made for itself, to the foreign mercenaries fighting Spain's wars. Spain was not a reservoir where the silver collected. Spain was a pipe. The silver flowed in one end and straight out the other, and the country barely got wet. If you want to understand how a river of the world's money ran through a country and left it poorer, you have to talk about one man, because his reign is where the paradox becomes undeniable. Not because he was a fool. He was the opposite, a relentless, meticulous, deeply serious administrator, but because his convictions turned the silver into a weapon aimed at his own kingdom. His name was Philip II, King of Spain from 1556 to 1598, at the absolute zenith of Spanish power. Philip was famous for his work ethic. He governed his enormous empire personally, from a desk, reading and annotating a staggering volume of documents by hand, a king who tried to run a quarter of the world by paperwork. He was pious to the point of severity, and he saw himself as the sword of the Catholic Church, the man whose divine duty was to crush Protestantism and defend the faith whatever the cost. Whatever the cost. Those are the operative words. Because Philip's wars were bottomless. The revolt in the Netherlands alone, the 80 Years' War as it came to be known, was a financial black hole that swallowed silver for decades and could not be won. He poured treasure into it year after year. He built and lost the enormous armada against England in 1588, an almost unimaginable expense sunk literally in a single campaign. And to feed all of this, he borrowed and borrowed against the silver fleets at brutal rates of interest from bankers he did not control. And so, under the most powerful monarch in the world, at the height of the greatest flow of treasure in history, something happened that should have been impossible. The Spanish crown went bankrupt. Not once. Philip II declared state bankruptcy in 1557, again in 1560, again in 1575, and again in 1596. 4 times. The richest king on earth, sitting on the greatest silver mine ever found, defaulting on his debts 4 separate times because the silver was always already promised, always already gone, and the wars never stopped needing more. The historian who studied this most closely, Earl Hamilton, working through the actual shipping registers in Seville, showed the paradox in the raw numbers. The treasure came in on a rising tide for decades, and the crown's finances got worse, not better, the whole time. More silver, more debt. That is not how anyone expects wealth to behave, but it is exactly how this machine was built to run. Now, the bankruptcies were the crown's problem. But the silver did something worse, something that reached past the king and into the life of every ordinary person in Spain. And this is the part of the story that turns it from a tale of royal mismanagement into something like a natural law of money. When you flood an economy with money faster than that economy can produce goods, the money does not make everyone richer. It makes everything more expensive. This is inflation, and in the 16th century nobody understood it because it had never happened at this scale before. Historians call what followed the price revolution. Over the course of the 16th century, prices in Spain rose to roughly 3 or 4 times what they had been, a slow, grinding, relentless increase that, spread across decades, was catastrophic for a pre-modern society that had always assumed prices were essentially fixed by God and tradition. In plain language, the silver made Spanish money worth less, and because Spanish money was now worth less, Spanish goods became expensive. It became cheaper for a Spaniard to buy grain, cloth, and manufactured goods from abroad, from France, from the Netherlands, from England, than to produce them at home. Spanish wheat could not compete with foreign wheat. Spanish workshops could not compete with foreign workshops. Why would you build an industry? Why would you plant the harder crop? Why would you invest in a farm or a factory at home when the silver made it cheaper and easier to simply buy everything from foreigners? So Spanish industry withered. Spanish agriculture withered. The country that had the most money in the world gradually lost the ability to make anything for itself, because the money itself had made making things unprofitable. There is a bitter Spanish saying from this era that captures it perfectly, that Spain had become the mouth that eats and the hands that work for everyone else. The treasure came in, and it went straight back out to pay foreigners for the food and goods Spain no longer produced. The crash, when it came, was not a sudden event. That is the horror of it. The house was already soaked in gasoline, an economy quietly being gutted from within, one uncompetitive farm and one shuttered workshop at a time, while everyone at the top was distracted by the dazzle of an endless river of treasure. And here is where the foreign bankers step out of the background and take center stage, because they are the ones who actually collected on all of it. Spain, remember, did not have a sophisticated financial industry of its own. When the crown needed to borrow against those silver fleets, it turned to the great international banking houses of the age, first the Fuggers of Augsburg, the German family who had bankrolled Charles V, and then increasingly the bankers of Genoa, the Italian financiers who became the true masters of Spanish crown debt under Philip II. These Genoese bankers were extraordinary. They developed the instruments, the asientos, the loan contracts, and the juros, the government bonds, that turned Spain's future silver into present cash. And they took as their price a share so large that over time the silver of the Americas was, in effect, flowing through Spain and into the vaults of Genoa. Think about the structure of this, because it is the whole thesis. The Spanish crown did the conquering, the indigenous people of the Andes did the dying, and the Genoese bankers, who did neither, collected the profit. Spain owned the mountain. The bankers owned the mountain's output. There is a reason one historian called the later 16th century the Age of the Genoese, because the men who quietly won the Spanish Empire's silver were not in Madrid. They were sitting in counting houses in Italy, holding contracts, waiting for the fleet. And this is the pattern you should recognize, because it recurs across every era this channel examines. The entity that holds the debt ends up with more real power than the entity that holds the crown. Spain had the empire, the armies, the mountain, the glory. The bankers had the paperwork. The paperwork won. There was one more mechanism that made the whole thing worse, and it involves the far side of the world, because Potosi silver did not only flow east to Europe, an enormous share of it flowed west across the Pacific to China, and understanding why completes the picture of Spain as a country that owned a treasure it could not hold on to. In the 16th century, China had an economy so vast and had shifted so decisively to using silver as its basis for money and taxation that it functioned like a gravitational well for the metal. Silver was worth substantially more in China than it was in Europe. You could buy far more with it there. So Spanish silver, minted into pieces of 8, was carried across the Pacific from Acapulco to the Spanish colony of Manila in the Philippines, and there it was traded to Chinese merchants for silk, porcelain, and spices. The silver flowed into China and largely never came back out. The Spanish were in effect running a second pipe, one that drained their treasure not to European bankers, but into the markets of Asia, in exchange for luxury goods that were consumed and gone. So now hold the full picture in your mind. The silver of Potosi is being drained in 2 directions at once. East, across the Atlantic, to the Genoese and the Dutch and the wars. West, across the Pacific, to China. The most concentrated source of money in the history of the world, and Spain sat in the middle of it, a country the treasure passed through on its way to somewhere else, a junction, not a destination. It taxed the flow, it borrowed against the flow, it spent the flow, but it could not keep the flow, because it had built an entire imperial economy on the assumption that you would never need to make anything yourself if you could simply buy it with silver, and the silver was always leaving. Now let me bring all these threads together, because the chain here is one of the great counterintuitive truths in the history of money. You had a mountain of almost pure silver, the single greatest concentration of money ever discovered, fall into the lap of the Spanish crown. You had a crown whose ambitions, endless religious wars across Europe, were so vast that it spent that silver before the ships carrying it had even sailed, borrowing against it at ruinous rates from foreign bankers it did not control. You had that borrowing produce not strength but 4 separate bankruptcies of the richest king on earth. You had the silver poured into the Spanish economy cause a century-long inflation that made Spanish goods too expensive to sell and Spanish farms too costly to work, so that Spanish industry and agriculture quietly died and the country lost the ability to produce for itself. You had the treasure flow straight through Spain and out, east to the bankers of Genoa who ended up owning the empire's output, and west across the Pacific to China, in exchange for luxuries that were consumed and gone. And at the end of it, the empire that had found the greatest fortune in human history was a shell, militarily overstretched, financially insolvent, economically hollow, and dependent on the very foreigners its silver had enriched. This is the thing the clean story gets exactly backwards. Spain did not decline in spite of the silver, Spain declined because of it. The treasure was not the reward that was tragically squandered, the treasure was the poison, and it worked precisely because it looked so much like a blessing that no one thought to refuse it. Economists have a name for this now, because Spain was not the last country it happened to. They call it the resource curse, the strange, well-documented pattern in which countries that discover enormous natural wealth, sudden oil or gold or diamonds or silver, very often end up poorer, more unequal, more corrupt, and more unstable than countries that have to build their wealth the hard way. Spain was the first great case study. The mountain that was supposed to make it invincible is the mountain that dissolved it. I want to stop the economics now because so far this has been a story about money, and underneath the money there was a mountain, and inside that mountain there were people, and what happened to them is the part that should never be reduced to a line in a ledger. Silver does not mine itself. Someone had to go into the Cerro Rico and tear it out at 4,000 meters in the dark, and the Spanish solved the labor problem with an institution called the Mita. The Mita was a forced labor draft adapted from an older Inca system, but the Spanish version was something far more lethal. Indigenous communities across a huge swath of the Andes were required to send a percentage of their adult men to Potosi to work in the mine for a set term, for wages so low they did not cover the cost of surviving there. Men walked for weeks to reach the mountain, sometimes bringing their families because they knew they might not return, and the villages they left behind were shattered. The historian Peter Bakewell and others have documented communities that fled their own homes to escape the draft, whole populations displacing themselves to avoid being sent to the mountain. Inside the Cerro Rico, the conditions are almost beyond description. Men descended into the shafts on rickety ladders carrying ore on their backs, in air thick with dust, and stayed underground for days at a stretch. And when the mercury refining process came in, the patio process that made the whole enterprise profitable, it added a slow chemical death on the surface to the fast physical death below. Mercury poisoning, the refining of silver at Potosi and the mercury mine at Huancavelica that supplied it consumed human beings on a scale that is difficult to hold in the mind. Nobody knows the true death toll. It ran across nearly 3 centuries, and the record keepers were not counting the dead carefully. But the estimates that historians have offered run into the many hundreds of thousands, and some of the higher popular figures reach into the millions. And even at the low end, the Cerro Rico earned the name the indigenous people gave it. They called it the mountain that eats men. Not a metaphor, a description. Silver went in one direction, out to Seville and Genoa and Manila, and men went in the other, down into the dark, and did not come back. And here is the distance that is the whole moral of the story. The Genoese banker holding the Asiento contract in his counting house in Italy, waiting for the fleet, calculating his interest, he never saw the mountain. He never smelled the mercury. He never watched a village empty itself to avoid the draft. The silver arrived in Seville already clean, already coined, already money, with no dust on it and no names attached. The people who designed the machine and collected its profits were an ocean and a continent away from the people it consumed. They almost always are. Here is what the ledgers actually mean, and why this is not just a story about the 16th century. Now, I want to be honest with you about the history, because the honest version is more useful than the simple one, and it is what separates understanding from myth. The silver did not do all of this by itself. Spain's decline had other causes too: a tax system that crushed the productive classes and exempted the nobility, a series of ruinously expensive strategic choices, the sheer impossibility of holding together an empire that stretched across the entire globe with 16th century communications. Some careful historians argue that the inflation would have come regardless, driven partly by population growth, and that Spain's problems were as much about how it chose to spend as about the silver itself. That is a fair correction, and you should hold it. The silver was not a single magic cause, it was an accelerant poured onto a fire that had other fuel. But that is exactly the point, and it is the same point every time on this channel. Because the silver did not need to be the only cause to be the decisive one. What the silver did was make the fatal choices easy. It let the crown avoid every hard decision. It never had to build a fair tax system, never had to nurture its own industries, never had to live within its means, never had to choose which wars it could not afford, because there was always another fleet coming, always more treasure to borrow against. Always a way to pay for the consequences of the last bad decision with the promise of the next mountain of silver. The curse of easy money is not that it makes you spend. It is that it lets you avoid ever learning how not to. And nobody in this story was a cartoon villain. Charles and Philip were not stupid men squandering a fortune out of greed. They were serious men trying to defend what they believed was a sacred empire, making rational decisions about how to pay for the war in front of them, one fleet at a time. The Genoese bankers were not conspirators. They were lending money at a profit, which is what bankers do. Each decision taken on its own made sense, and the sum of all those sensible decisions was the hollowing out of the richest empire on earth. You do not need a plot. You need a flood of easy money, a set of powerful people each solving their own immediate problem with it, and no one, anywhere, whose job it is to ask what happens to a country that forgets how to make anything. The mechanism never went away. Every time a nation strikes sudden wealth, the oil states of the 20th century are the textbook modern case, and watches that wealth strengthen its currency, wither its other industries, enrich a narrow band of insiders and foreign financiers, and leave it more fragile than before. You are watching the Potosi machine run again. The economists gave it a clinical name, the resource curse. But the Spanish lived the first and greatest version of it, and they left us the warning in the plainest possible form. They found the richest thing on earth, and it ruined them, because a country is not rich because of what it owns, it is rich because of what it can do, and no amount of treasure can buy that back once the treasure itself has taught you to stop doing it. Potosi is still there. It is a city in Bolivia, and men still go into the Cerro Rico to dig, in conditions that are still lethal, for the scraps of a mountain that 4 centuries ago was the richest place in the world. It is one of the poorest regions of one of the poorest countries in South America. The silver made someone rich. It was never the people who lived on the mountain, and in the end, it was never even Spain. If this changed the way you think about wealth, about the difference between having money and being rich, hit subscribe. We go deep on the financial machinery running underneath the events you thought you understood, the deals, the ledgers, the flows of treasure, the curses that arrive dressed as blessings, and drop a comment, because I want to know where you land on this one. What actually ruined Spain? Was it the silver itself and the inflation it caused? Was it the endless religious wars that spent it? Or was it the foreign bankers who ended up owning the flow? I've got my own view, and I'm genuinely not sure it's right. Like the video if you would. It genuinely helps this reach the people who care about how money actually moves. I'll see you in the next one.